This lecture will be the first of two on the American Civil War. By February 7th, 1861, seven of the southernmost states had already seceded and formed the Confederacy. Confederate soldiers immediately occupied all federal property in those states, especially fortifications. By the time of Lincoln's inauguration as President of the United States on March 4th, 1861, only two southern forts remained in Union hands. The most critical of these was Fort Sumter, defending the mouth of Charleston Harbor. The day following Lincoln's inauguration, he received an urgent dispatch from Fort Sumter's commander, Major Robert Anderson. The Confederacy, specifically the state of South Carolina, was demanding that Anderson surrender or face attack, and his supplies would last 6 weeks at most. So Lincoln's dilemma was as follows. If Lincoln ordered the Navy to force its way into Charleston Harbor to reinforce Anderson, Lincoln would be responsible for starting the hostilities. This might prompt the slave states still in the Union to secede. If Lincoln ordered that Fort Sumter be evacuated, he would be treating the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. Such action would anger the Republican Party, weaken Lincoln's administration, and endanger the Union. Cleverly, Lincoln determined not to abandon Sumter's garrison, but only to resupply it, thus placing Jefferson Davis in a dilemma. If Davis did nothing, he damaged the image of the Confederacy as a sovereign, independent nation. If he ordered an attack, he turned peaceful secession into war. Davis chose war. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., Confederate batteries encircling Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter. Charleston citizens watched the bombardments from the rooftops of their houses. Some cheered as if it were a fireworks display, while others openly wept at the fact that Americans were now at war with each other. Confederate batteries fired over 4,000 rounds at Fort Sumter. The Union garrison returned fire until their ammunition was nearly exhausted before Major Anderson decided to surrender the fort. News of Fort Sumter's fall unified the North. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. The response was overwhelming. In Iowa alone, over 20 times the state's quota rushed to enlist. But Lincoln's call for troops provoked a very different reaction in the South. On April 17th, Virginia seceded because she was unwilling to fight against other southern states. This was a terrible loss for the Union because Virginia was the most populous southern state as well as the most industrialized. In May, Arkansas, Tennessee, and finally North Carolina joined Virginia. There were now 11 states in the Confederacy. The anti-slavery western counties of Virginia would eventually secede from Virginia in 1863 and form the new Union state of West Virginia. The 4 remaining slave states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union, and in each state regiments were raised for both the Union and Confederate armies. Northerners and Southerners alike expected a short, glorious war. Soldiers left for the front with bands playing and crowds cheering. Both sides felt that right was on their side. In reality, the two sides were very unevenly matched. The Union enjoyed enormous advantages and resources over the South: more manpower, industry, food, production, and an extensive railroad system. Lincoln proved to be a decisive yet patient leader, skillful at balancing the political factions within his administration. The Confederacy also enjoyed some advantages, most notably King Cotton and the profits it earned, a number of first-rate generals, a strong military tradition, and soldiers who were highly motivated because they were defending their homeland. However, the South also had a tradition of local and limited government, and there was resistance to the centralization of government necessary to successfully fight a war. Several Southern governors were so obstinate in their insistence on states' rights that they refused to cooperate with Davis's Confederate government. The North and South pursued different military strategies. The Union plan was actually a 3-part plan. In order to win the war, the North must conquer the South. And so the first part of the plan was for the Union Navy to blockade all Southern ports. The Confederacy could neither export cotton nor import desperately needed war material. The second part of the plan was for Union riverboats and armies to move down the Mississippi River and then split the Confederacy in two. Finally, Union armies would move to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. Northern newspapers dubbed this three-part plan the Anaconda Plan because it resembled a huge boa constrictor choking the South and squeezing it to death. The goal of the Confederate plan was simply to survive as a nation. The strategy was mostly defensive, but generals were encouraged to attack, possibly invade the North if the opportunity arose. The first major bloodshed of the war occurred on July 21, 1861. General Irwin McDowell led an inexperienced army of 30,000 Union troops towards the Confederate capital at Richmond. They encountered an equally inexperienced Confederate army encamped only 25 miles from Washington, D.C., near a little creek called Bull Run. Lincoln ordered McDowell to attack. "You are green, it is true," Lincoln said, "but they are green also." McDowell's troops enjoyed the upper hand in the early stages of the battle, but an inspirational defense by Confederate Virginia General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson and the arrival of Confederate reinforcements in the afternoon turned the tide in the Confederacy's favor. Routed Union troops began a panicky retreat to Washington, which was further hampered by the fact that many Washington civilians had followed the army to the battlefield with picnic lunches, and now they were caught up in the retreat. Lincoln responded to the defeat at Bull Run by calling for the enlistment of 500,000 men to serve for 3 years instead of 3 months. 3 days later, he called for an additional 500,000 men. He also appointed General George McClellan to lead this new Union army, now encamped near Washington, D.C. While McClellan drilled his army, soon to be known as the Army of the Potomac, Union forces in the West began to fight for control of the Mississippi. In February 1862, a Union army led by General Ulysses S. Grant invaded western Tennessee. Grant, a rumpled West Point veteran, had failed at everything he had tried in civilian life, whether it had been as a farmer, a bill collector, a real estate agent, or a hat store clerk. However, he was a brave, tough, and decisive military commander. In just 11 days, Grant's forces captured 2 Confederate forts that held strategic positions on important rivers: Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. At Fort Donelson, Grant sent word to the Confederate commander that no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. The Confederates surrendered, and from that point forward, people said that Grant's initials, U.S., stood for Unconditional Surrender Grant. 1 month after the victories at Forts Henry and Donelson in late March 1862, Grant gathered his troops near a small Tennessee church named Shiloh, near the Mississippi border. Confederate generals gathered their forces to move against Grant, and early on the morning of April 6, 1862, thousands of Confederate soldiers burst from the woods surrounding Grant's camps and surprised his waking army. Many Union soldiers were shot in their blankets or while they were making coffee. The initial Confederate assault met great success, but was slowed by pockets of obstinate Union resistance that bought Grant valuable time. Overnight, Grant reorganized his battered troops, called up reinforcements, and counterattacked the next morning. By mid-afternoon, the Confederates were beaten and retreating from the battlefield. The Battle of Shiloh taught both sides a strategic lesson. Generals now realized that they had to send out scouts to watch for approaching enemy forces, and they must dig trenches and field fortifications to defend their positions. Shiloh also demonstrated how bloody the war might become. Of the nearly 100,000 troops engaged in the fighting at Shiloh, over 1/4 were killed, wounded, or missing. While the battle appeared to be a draw, it had a long-term effect on the war. The Confederate failure to hold the Ohio-Kentucky frontier showed that at least part of the Union's three-pronged strategy, the drive to take the Mississippi and split the Confederacy in half, just might succeed. As Grant pushed towards the Mississippi River, a Union fleet of about 40 warships under the command of 60-year-old Admiral David G. Farragut approached the mouth of the Mississippi in Louisiana. with the goal of capturing New Orleans, the Confederacy's largest city and busiest port. On April 24th, Farragut ran his fleet past the two Confederate forts defending the mouth of the river. 5 days later, the U.S. flag once again flew over the city of New Orleans. During the next 2 months, Farragut also took control of Baton Rouge and Natchez. If the Union managed to take control of all the major cities along the Mississippi, then Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas would be cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. By this point, only Port Hudson, Louisiana, and Vicksburg, Mississippi, a heavily fortified city perched high on a bluff above the Mississippi River, remained in Confederate control. Several advances in technology made their debut on these early Civil War battlefields. These advances changed military strategy and contributed to the war's high casualty rates. Instrumental to the success of Grant and Farragut in the West was the ironclad warship. Ironclads could withstand heavy cannon fire, resist burning, and splinter conventional wooden warships. Grant used 4 ironclads when he captured Forts Henry and Donelson. On March 9, 1862, naval warfare was changed forever when 2 ironclads met in waters off Hampton Roads, Virginia, in the first ironclad versus ironclad duel. In 1861, a Union steam frigate, the USS Merrimac, was sunk off the coast of Virginia to prevent its capture by Confederate forces. The Confederates recovered the hull of the ship, which had not been destroyed by the fire, and Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen R. Mallory put engineers to work rebuilding the ship and plating it with iron. The Confederates renamed the new ironclad Virginia. When Union Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles heard of this development, he determined to respond in kind. He commissioned naval engineer John Erickson to design a warship that would counter the Confederates' Virginia. Erickson's design, called the Monitor, resembled a gigantic cheese box on an immense shingle, with 2 naval cannon mounted inside a revolving turret. On March 8, 1862, the Confederate Virginia attacked the Union fleet blockading Hampton Roads, sinking 1 Union warship, burning a second, and driving a third aground before breaking off the fighting at the end of the day. When the Virginia returned on the morning of March 9th to finish the Union fleet, it was met by the Monitor. Hours of fighting ended in a draw in which neither ship could significantly damage the other, but the day of the wooden fighting ship was over. Even more deadly than the development of the ironclad were improvements to the rifle and rifle ammunition called mini balls, an improved cylindroconnoidal bullet. Rifles were more accurate than old-fashioned smoothbore muskets. The rifle could be loaded faster and was deadlier at greater ranges. While this weaponry improved, battlefield tactics did not change, and troops still fought in linear formations with men lined up shoulder to shoulder that made it difficult to miss with the new rifles. Casualty rates soared with each passing battle. As the war progressed, the soldiers, and eventually the commanders, realized it was no longer reasonable to fight on open ground in lines of battle. Instead, soldiers began fortifying their positions on the battlefield, and trench warfare was introduced 50 years before it would define fighting in World War I. As the campaign for the West progressed and the Union Navy tightened its blockade of southern ports, the third part of the Union's war plan, the plan to capture the new Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, faltered. One of the problems was the Union commander, General George McClellan. McClellan was an excellent administrator and was very popular with his troops, but he was extremely cautious on the battlefield. After 5 months of training the Army of the Potomac's 120,000 men, he insisted he could not move against Richmond until he had an army of over 270,000 men. He complained also that there were only 2 bridges across the Potomac River, not enough for an orderly retreat should he lose a battle to the Confederates on the Virginia side of the river. Northern newspapers quickly began to mock McClellan's daily bulletins of "all quiet along the Potomac," and even the patient Lincoln commented that he would like to, quote, borrow McClellan's army if the general himself was not going to use it, end quote. After dawdling all winter, McClellan finally got underway in the spring of 1862. He transported the entire Army of the Potomac by ship to the peninsula of Virginia, a narrow strip of land that lay between the James and York rivers. His plan was to advance straight up the peninsula to the Confederate capital at Richmond. As McClellan began his advance, he was met by Confederate forces under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston. In a series of battles, McClellan pushed Johnston back, marching closer and closer to Richmond with each passing day, until Johnston was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines on May 31, 1862. With Johnston wounded, command of the Confederate Army passed to General Robert E. Lee. Lee was very different from McClellan. He was modest rather than vain and willing to go beyond conventional military textbook strategy if the situation promised results that outweighed the risks. Lee, who had been in command of the Marines that had put down John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859, had been adamantly opposed to secession and had in fact been offered command of all Union armies when the war started. But when Lee's beloved state of Virginia seceded, he declined the offer to lead the Union armies and cast his lot with the Confederacy. Now, determined to save Richmond for capture, Lee immediately went on the offensive. He moved against McClellan in a series of engagements known as the 7 Days Battles, fought from June 25th through July 1st, 1862. Although Lee's Confederates were outnumbered by McClellan's forces and suffered higher casualties in each of these battles, Lee's determination and unorthodox tactics unnerved McClellan so badly that McClellan began backing his army away from the Confederate capital and retreated back down the peninsula to his supply base near the sea. McClellan's inability to produce results on the peninsula led to his removal as commander of the Union Army of the Potomac. He was replaced by General John Pope, whose ineptitude was surpassed only by his ego and boastfulness. With the threat to Richmond removed, Lee was now free to move against the Union capital at Washington. On August 29th and 30th, 1862, Lee won a resounding victory over Pope at the Second Battle of Bull Run, fought on the same battlefield as the first. A few days later, Lee moved his army, known as the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, across the Potomac River and into Maryland. As Lee's Confederates invaded Northern Territory, the government in Washington panicked and prevailed upon Lincoln to restore McClellan to command of the Army of the Potomac. At this point, McClellan also had a tremendous stroke of luck. A Union corporal, exploring a meadow where Confederates had recently camped on their march northward, found a copy of Lee's orders to his commanders wrapped around a bunch of cigars. McClellan now had Lee's invasion plans and knew exactly when and where the Confederates intended to move. These plans revealed that at that time, Lee's army was temporarily divided, and one wing under Stonewall Jackson was capturing Harper's Ferry, while the second wing under Lee's direct command continued to march north. For once, McClellan acted aggressively and quickly pushed the Army of the Potomac into action, racing to catch Lee's wing of the Confederate Army. McClellan encountered Lee outside the village of Sharpsburg, Maryland, along the banks of Antietam Creek on September 17, 1862. The ensuing clash, called the Battle of Antietam by the North and the Battle of Sharpsburg by the South, proved to be the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. Casualties totaled more than 26,000 men, as many as the War of 1812 and the War with Mexico in 1846 and 47 combined. Stonewall Jackson arrived on the battlefield as the fighting started, and with his army reunited, Lee was able to fight McClellan to a draw. The battle itself was a standoff, but Lee had lost nearly 25% of his men. On September 18th, Lee withdrew the Army of Northern Virginia from the battlefield and retreated back across the Potomac River to Virginia. Rather than pursuing the battered Confederate army and possibly ending the war, McClellan, cautious as always, did nothing. On November 7, 1862, Lincoln fired McClellan, a general that he characterized as having the slows. While this solved one problem, Lincoln would soon find himself under diplomatic pressure from France and Britain and from abolitionists at home. Shortly after the Civil War began, William Yancey of Alabama and two other Confederate diplomats asked Britain, a major importer of Southern cotton, to formally recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. The British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs met with them twice, but in May 1861, Britain announced its neutrality in the American conflict. Yancey returned home and told his fellow Southerners not to hope for British aid. In spite of this, many Southerners continued to hope that economic necessity would force Britain to come to their aid. Meanwhile, abolitionists waged a public opinion war against slavery, not only in Europe, but in the North as well. A number of economic factors made Britain no longer dependent on Southern cotton. Not only had Britain accumulated a large cotton inventory just before the outbreak of the war, it also found new sources of cotton in Egypt and India. Moreover, when Europe's wheat crop failed, northern wheat and corn replaced southern cotton as an essential import. As one magazine put it, Old King Cotton is dead and buried. Britain decided that neutrality would be its best policy, at least for a while. In the fall of 1861, an incident occurred that tested that neutrality. The Confederate government sent two diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell, in a second attempt to gain support from Britain and France. The two men traveled across the Atlantic aboard the British merchant ship Trent. Captain Charles Wilkes of the Union warship San Jacinto stopped the Trent at sea, and upon discovering the two Confederate diplomats, placed them under arrest. Britain threatened war against the Union and dispatched 8,000 troops to Canada. Keenly aware that the Union could not afford to fight more than one war at a time, Lincoln freed the two Confederate prisoners and publicly claimed that Captain Wilkes had acted without orders. Britain was as relieved as the United States to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. As the South struggled in vain to gain foreign recognition, abolitionist feeling grew in the North. Some Northerners believed that just winning the war would not be enough if the issue of slavery was not permanently settled. Although Lincoln disliked slavery, he did not believe that the federal government had the power to abolish it where it already existed. When Horace Greeley urged him in 1862 to transform the war into an abolitionist crusade, Lincoln replied that although it was his personal wish that all men could be free, his official duty was different. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union," said Lincoln, "and it is not either to save or destroy slavery." As the war progressed, however, Lincoln did find a way to use his constitutional war powers to end slavery. Slave labor built fortifications and grew food for the Confederacy, thus supporting the Confederate war effort. As Commander-in-Chief, Lincoln decided that just as he could order the Union Army to seize Confederate supplies, he could authorize that army to emancipate slaves. Emancipation offered a strategic benefit. The abolitionist movement was strong in Britain, and emancipation would discourage Britain from supporting the Confederacy. Emancipation was no longer just a moral issue, it was now a weapon of war. Lincoln had also been reluctant to act on emancipation while Union armies were not victorious on the battlefield, as it would make any action on emancipation appear to be an act of desperation. While not an outright victory, Lee's retreat from Northern Territory following the Battle of Antietam allowed Lincoln to act on emancipation from what appeared to be a position of strength. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. The following portion captured national attention. All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerable judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. The proclamation did not free any slaves immediately because it applied only to areas behind Confederate lines outside of Union control. Since the proclamation was a military action aimed at the states in rebellion, it did not apply to Southern territory already occupied by Union troops, nor to the slave states that had not seceded from the Union. Although the proclamation did not have much of a practical effect, it had immense symbolic importance. For many, the proclamation gave the war a higher moral purpose by turning the struggle into a fight to free the slaves instead of just a fight to save the Union. Free blacks also welcomed the section of the proclamation that allowed them to enlist in the Union Army. Even though many had volunteered at the beginning of the war, the regular army had refused to take them. Now they could take up arms themselves to help put an end to slavery. Not everyone in the North approved of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Democrats proclaimed it would only prolong the war by antagonizing the South. Many Union soldiers accepted it grudgingly, saying they had no love for abolitionists or African Americans, but they would support emancipation if that's what it took to reunify the nation. Confederates reacted to the proclamation with outrage. Jefferson Davis called it the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty man. As Northern Democrats predicted, the proclamation made the Confederacy more determined more determined than ever to fight to preserve its way of life. After the Emancipation Proclamation, compromise was no longer an option. The Confederacy knew that if it lost the war, its slaveholding society would perish, and the Union knew that if it could win only by defeating the Confederacy. From January 1st, 1863 on, it was a fight to the death. Neither side in the Civil War was completely unified. There were Confederate sympathizers in the North and Union sympathizers in the South. Such divided loyalties created two problems. How should the respective governments handle their critics, and how could they ensure a steady supply of fighting men for their armies? Lincoln dealt forcefully with disloyalty. For example, when a Baltimore crowd attacked a Union regiment 1 week after Fort Sumter, Lincoln sent federal troops to Maryland. He also suspended the writ of habeas corpus, a court order that required authorities to bring a person held in jail before the court in person to determine why he or she is being jailed. Lincoln used the same strategy later in the war to deal with dissent in other states. As a result, more than 13,000 suspected Confederate sympathizers in the Union were arrested and held without trial, although most were quickly released. Lincoln also seized telegraph offices to make sure no one used the wires for subversion. When Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney declared that Lincoln had gone beyond his constitutional powers, the president ignored his ruling. Those arrested in the North included Copperheads, or Northern Democrats who advocated peace with the South. Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham was the most famous Copperhead. Vallandigham was tried and convicted by a military court for urging Union soldiers to desert and for advocating an armistice or ceasefire. Confederate President Jefferson Davis at first denounced Lincoln's suspension of civil liberties. However, later Davis found it necessary to follow Lincoln's example. In 1862, he suspended habeas corpus in the Confederacy. Lincoln's action in dramatically expanding presidential powers to meet the crises of wartime set a precedent in U.S. history. Since then, some presidents have cited war or national security as a reason to expand the powers of the executive branch of the government. Although both armies relied heavily on volunteers to fill their ranks, it did not take long for heavy casualties and widespread desertions to deplete armies on both sides. Both sides soon resorted to conscription, or a draft forcing members of the population to serve in the Army. The Confederacy initially drafted all able-bodied white men between the ages of 18 and 35, but losses eventually became so heavy that by 1864 the South expanded those ages to 17 and 50 and often formed regiments of young boys even younger. Those who could afford to were allowed to hire substitutes to serve in their places. The law also exempted all planters who owned 20 or more slaves. Poor whites, who made up a large majority of the Southern white population, howled that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. In spite of these protests, almost 90% of eligible Southern men served in the Confederate Army. The Union conscription law drafted white men between the ages of 20 and 45 for 3 years, but it also allowed draftees to hire substitutes. The Northern law also provided for commutation or paying a $300 fee to avoid conscription altogether. In the end, only about 46,000 draftees went into the Union Army. 92% of the approximately 2 million soldiers who served in the Union Army were volunteers. Nearly 180,000 of those were African American. In 1863, New York City was a tinderbox waiting to explode. Poor people were crowded into slums, crime and disease ran rampant, and poverty was widespread. Poor white workers, especially Irish immigrants, thought it unfair that they should have to fight a war to free slaves who may eventually compete with them for jobs. When officials began to draw names for the draft, angry men gathered all over the city to complain. For 4 days, from July 13th through 16th, mobs rampaged through the city. The rioters wrecked draft offices, Republican newspaper offices, and the homes of anti-slavery leaders. They attacked well-dressed men, those most likely able to pay the $300 commutation fee, and African Americans. By the time federal troops put an end to the riots, more than 100 people lay dead. The draft riots were not the only dramatic development away from the battlefield. Society was experiencing other types of unrest in both the North and the South. Mary Chesnut, a well-known Southerner whose husband served in the Confederate government, kept a diary describing key war events, such as the bombardment of Fort Sumter at the beginning of the war. Her diary paints a vivid picture as well of the marriages, flirtations, hospital work, and dinner parties that comprised daily life for wealthy Southerners. In 1864, Chesnut found that her social standing could no longer protect her from the economic effects of the war. On September 19th of that year, she wrote, "My pink silk dress I have sold for $600 to be paid in installments, $200 a month for 3 months. And I sell my eggs and butter from home for $200 a month, $400 a month, regularly. In what? In Confederate money, alas." The Confederate money Chesnut received was almost worthless. By 1864, inflation, the sharp increase in the cost of living, had devalued Confederate currency to such an extent that $400 was worth only $1 or $2 compared to pre-war currency. Not all of the effects of the war were economic. There were profound social changes as well. African Americans played an important role in the struggle to end slavery. Some served as soldiers while others took action off the battlefield. When the Civil War started, it was a white man's war. Neither the Union or the Confederacy officially accepted African Americans as soldiers. In 1862, Congress passed a law allowing African Americans to serve in the military. But it was only after the Emancipation Proclamation was decreed, however, that large-scale enlistment occurred. Although African Americans made up only 1% of the North's population, by war's end, nearly 10% of the Union Army was African American. The majority were former slaves. Although accepted as soldiers, African Americans still suffered discrimination. They served in separate regiments commanded by white officers. Usually they could not rise above the rank of a non-commissioned officer, although there are a few rare examples of men being promoted for gallantry and one who attained the rank of lieutenant colonel as a surgeon. White privates earned $13 a month in the Army, plus a clothing allowance of $3.50 a month. But black privates earned only $10 a month with no clothing allowance. Blacks protested and several regiments served without pay for months, rather than accept the lesser amount. Congress finally equalized the pay of white and African American soldiers in 1864. The mortality rate for African American soldiers was higher than that for white soldiers, primarily because many African Americans were assigned to labor duty in the garrisons, where they were more likely to catch typhoid, pneumonia, malaria, or some other deadly disease. Also, the Confederacy would not treat captured Americans as prisoners of war. In fact, many were executed on the spot, and those who were not killed were returned to slavery. A particularly gruesome massacre occurred at Fort Pillow, Tennessee in 1864, when Confederate troops executed over 200 African American prisoners as they begged for their lives. Even though most Southerners opposed the idea of African American soldiers, the Confederacy did consider drafting slaves and free blacks in 1863 and again in 1864. One Louisiana planter argued that, since slaves caused the fight, they should share in the burden of battle. Georgia General Howell Cobb responded, "If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." As Union forces pushed deeper into Confederate territory, thousands of slaves sought freedom behind the lines of the Union Army. Those who remained on plantations sometimes engaged in sabotage or other forms of passive resistance, such as breaking plows and tools, destroying fences, and neglecting livestock. When Southern plantation owners fled before advancing Union forces, many slaves refused to be dragged along and stayed behind to welcome the Yankees, who had the power to liberate them. For whites on farms and plantations in the South, slave resistance compounded the stresses and privations of war. Fearful of a general slave uprising, Southerners tightened slave patrols and spread rumors about how Union soldiers abused runaways. No general uprising occurred, but resistance gradually weakened the plantation system. By 1864, even many Confederates realized that slavery was doomed. The decline of the plantation system was not the only economic effect that the Civil War caused. Other effects included inflation and a new type of federal tax. In general, the war expanded the North's economy while shattering the economy of the South. The Confederacy soon faced a food shortage due to three factors: the drain of manpower into the Army, the Union occupation of food-growing areas, and the loss of slaves to work the fields. Meat became a once-a-week luxury at best, and even such staples as rice and corn were in short supply. Food prices skyrocketed. In 1861, the average Southern family spent $6.65 a month on food. By mid-1863, it was spending $68 a month, if it could find any food to buy. The situation grew so desperate that in 1863, hundreds of women and children, and some men, stormed bakeries and rioted for bread in Richmond, Virginia. The mob broke up only when President Jefferson Davis climbed up on a cart, threw down all the money he had, and ordered the crowd to disperse or be shot. The next day, the Confederate government distributed some of its stocks of rice to starving civilians. The Union blockade of Southern ports created shortages of other items too, including salt, sugar, coffee, nails, needles, and medicines. One result was that many Confederates smuggled cotton into the North in exchange for gold, food, and other goods. Deploring this illegal trade with the enemy, one Confederate general raged that cotton had made more damn rascals on both sides than anything else. Overall, the war's effect on the economy in the North was much more positive. Although a few industries, such as cotton textiles, declined, most boomed. The Army's need for uniforms, shoes, guns, and other supplies supported woolen mills, steel foundries, coal mines, and many other industries. Because the draft reduced the available workforce, Western wheat farmers bought new mechanical reapers and other labor-saving machines which benefited the companies that manufactured those machines. The economic boom had a dark side. Wages did not keep up with prices, and many people's standard of living declined. When white male workers went out on strike, employers hired free blacks, immigrants, women, and boys to replace them for lower pay. Northern women, who like many Southern women replaced men on farms and in city jobs, also obtained government jobs for the first time. They worked mostly as clerks, copying ledgers and letters by hand. Although they earned less than men, they remained a regular part of the Washington workforce after the war. Because of the booming economy and rising prices, many businesses in the North made immense profits. This was especially true of those with government contracts, mostly because such contractors often cheated. They supplied uniforms and blankets made of shoddy, or fibers reclaimed from rags that came apart in the rain. They passed off spoiled meat as fresh and demanded twice the usual price for guns. The corruption spilled over into general society. The New York Herald commented on the changes in the American character. The individual who makes the most money, no matter how, and spends the most, no matter for what, is considered the greatest man. The world has seen its Iron Age, its Silver Age, its Golden Age, its Brazen Age. This is the age of shoddy. Congress decided to help pay for the war by tapping its citizens' wealth. In 1863, Congress enacted the tax law that authorized the nation's first income tax, a tax that takes a specified percentage of an individual's income. Soldiers on both sides marched off to war in the spring of 1861, thinking it would be a glorious affair. They were soon disillusioned, not just by heavy casualties, but also by poor living conditions, diet, and medical care. Garbage disposal in latrines and army camps were almost unknown. Although Army regulations called for washing one's hands and face every day and taking a complete bath once a week, many soldiers failed to do so. As a result, body lice, dysentery, and diarrhea were common. Army rations were far from appealing. Union troops subsisted on beans, bacon, and hardtack, a square, mass-produced biscuit reportedly hard enough to stop a bullet. Confederate troops fared equally poorly. A common food was kush, a stew of small cubes of beef and crumbled cornbread mixed with bacon grease. Fresh vegetables were hardly ever available. Both sides loved coffee, but Southern soldiers often had to settle for substitutes made from peanuts, dried apples, or corn. Soon after Fort Sumter fell, the federal government set up the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Its task was twofold: to improve the hygienic conditions of Army camps and to recruit and train nurses. The Sanitary Commission proved to be a great success. It sent out agents to teach soldiers such things as how to avoid polluting their water supply and developed hospital trains and ships to transport the wounded from the battlefield. At the age of 60, Dorothea Dix became the nation's first superintendent of women nurses. To discourage women from looking for romance, Dix insisted that applicants to the nursing corps be at least 30 and very plain looking. Impressed by the work of women nurses, he observed the Surgeon General required that at least 1/3 of Union hospital nurses be women. Some 3,000 eventually served in this capacity. Union nurse Clara Barton often cared for the sick and wounded at the front lines. After she displayed tremendous courage under fire during the Battle of Antietam, one surgeon described her as the angel of the battlefield. As a result of the Sanitary Commission's work, the death rate among Union wounded, although terrible by 21st century standards, showed considerable improvement over previous wars. The Confederacy did not have a Sanitary Commission, but thousands of Southern women served as nurses. Sally Tompkins, for example, performed so heroically in her hospital duties that she was eventually commissioned a captain in the Confederate Army. Improvements in hygiene and nursing did not reach Civil War prisons, where conditions were even worse than in Army camps. The worst Confederate prison at Andersonville, Georgia, jammed 33,000 Union prisoners of war into 26 acres, or about 34 square feet per man. The prisoners had no shelter from the broiling sun or chilling rain except what they made for themselves by rigging primitive tents out of blankets and sticks. They drank from the same stream they used as a sewer. About 1/3 of Andersonville's prisoners died. Part of the blame rested on the camp's commander, Captain Henry Wirtz, whom the North eventually executed as a war criminal. The South's lack of food and tent canvas also contributed to the appalling conditions. In addition, the prisons were overcrowded because the North had halted the practice of prisoner exchanges when the South refused to return African American soldiers who had been captured in battle. Prison camps in the North, such as those at Elmira, New York, and Point Lookout, Maryland, were only slightly better. Northern prisons provided about 5 times as much space per man, barracks for sleeping, and adequate food. However, thousands of Confederates housed in quarters with little or no heat contracted pneumonia and died. Hundreds of others suffered from dysentery and malnutrition, from which some did not recover. Historians estimate that 15% of Union prisoners in Southern prisons died, while 12% of Confederate prisoners died in Northern prisons.